Hi, everyone, and welcome back. For those who are just joining us, you are at the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub Conference, What's Next for Safeguarding Against SCH? The Importance of CSO Engagement in Shaping Sustainable Solutions. We are moving on to our second panel of today, which is about intersectionality and safeguarding. We will focus on inclusive PSCH approaches. We'll discuss the different barriers that various groups face and the overlapping identities that place them at increased risk of SCH. And we will hear from our panelists on how to develop and embed strategies to reduce the risk of SCH and how to apply an intersectional lens to our work. Our speakers during this session are Adetunde Ademefun, the head of the National Secretariat and Director of Programs with the Joint National Association of Persons with Disabilities. We also have Nazly Qumrunnessa, the RSH Bangladesh Safeguarding Consultant, and she is also a human rights lawyer. We have Festus Kisa, who is an independent consultant, and we have Emily Elderfield, who is an advocacy lead with Clear Global. It's great to have you on our panel today. We're kicking off this panel with a case study. Nazly Qumrunnessa has something to share with us about the Hijra community in Bangladesh. Nazly, please take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Fabienne, and thank you other two panelists and the audience of the session. I am Qumrunnessa Nazly. I work with the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub in Bangladesh as a senior advisor. Apart from that, I work as a consultant researcher based in Dhaka. And though I work on various issues of human rights, but my areas of expertise and interest is on gender equality, women's rights, and on social inclusion. With this background, I am going to share our experience, the experience of RSH Hub in Bangladesh, from the development of a tip sheet on the SCH risk and other harms for the Hijra community in Bangladesh. I would like to share or start with the background information about the Hijra population. Next slide, please. The Hijra population is one of the gender diverse population groups in Bangladesh. It refers to individuals outside the binary of male and female. Though there is no universally recognized or agreed definition, it refers to a socio-cultural identity of a group of gender diverse people who live as a community through a master discipline model. They follow their own dialect and social customs and belong to their distinct spirituality. They have their traditional livelihoods. But important to share that these groups are one of the most marginalized communities in Bangladesh. They face extreme discrimination and harassment in accessing education, healthcare, housing, employment, legal support, etc. And with this tip sheet, we wanted to highlight the SCH risk that the Hijra people experience, and also to identify the possible ways to address those risks. We did this exercise in close consultation with the Hijra community, and we also had consultation with the CSOs who work for the protection of the rights of the Hijra community. Apart from that, extensive desk research was also done for this purpose. Now, if we go to the next slide, to share with you about the SH risk for the Hijra population in Bangladesh. Hijra population face SH risk in different spheres of life, including family, community, educational institutions, and the workplace, such as intimidation, verbal and physical violence, sexual and emotional violence, etc. They face, deprivation, exploitation, and in the family as well. And this is the reality that due to the constant negligence and non-acceptance of the parents and other family members, Hijra people are forced to leave the family and their parents. At educational institutions, they frequently experience bullying, sexual harassments by fellow students and teachers. They also experience different forms of abuse and violence, exploitation like verbal and physical and mental abuse, sexual harassment, and exploitation in the community and public places. During the consultations, they shared that people stare at them like they are seeing an animal at the zoo. And sometimes co-passengers, they don't want to sit next to them because of their identity. They are also subjected to different types of abuse and harassment at work. This includes cyberbullying, blackmailing, sexual harassment, etc. And the HISRA representatives we consulted with, they shared that the co-workers, they don't welcome the HISRA employees at workplace. And very often the co-workers address them in a disrespectful manner. We can also see the issues of intersectionality, like how intersectional identities increase the risk of SEH and other harms for the HISRA people, even within and among the different HISRAs. Like HISRAs who work at the community, they are more vulnerable to SEH risk than the HISRA who are employed for desk-based work. And consultations with the HISRA people also suggested that there are increased risks for those who have no education or who have very little education and who are from lower socioeconomic background. Now, if we go to the next slide, we can see what measures need to be taken to address this risk. To address the SEH risk for the HISRA population, we need to take into account the socio-cultural context of the discrimination and deprivation of the HISRA community, because we see that they experience the risk in different layers, starting from the family to the community and to the state level. And the root causes are all interconnected. Therefore, there needs concerted efforts at different levels, like there needs awareness and sensitivity at the family and community levels to change the misconception and prejudice so that the people with the HISRA identity, they can have a dignified life. They can live with their families that would be free from any form of discrimination and exploitation or deprivation. There also needs training and sensitivity of the teachers and other members associated with the educational institutions so that the students with the HISRA identity, they can have an enabling learning environment. There also needs a kind of integration about the rights and well-being of the HISRA population into the educational curriculum. And once HISRA representatives of the HISRA population are at workplace, their needs, the employers need to be aware of the SEH risk that the HISRA employees are they're vulnerable to, and need to take efforts to address those risks. Like there needs organizational commitment to ensuring the recruitment of the HISRA population and ensuring that applicants are not discriminated against due to their gender identification. This is important because though some employers started recruiting HISRA population groups, but very few in numbers. That's why this is important to mention and to share it. And once they are at work, there needs leadership commitment from the employer's side to ensure an inclusive organizational cultures, to ensuring a safe work environment for the HISRA population. If we go to the next slide, then. So organizations need to adopt zero-tolerance approach to harassment, abuse, and discrimination against Hijra and other gender diverse employees. This could be done through organizational policy and code of conduct. There also needs to establish a safe and accessible reporting system. To enable that, Hijra staff can report on concern on SCH and other forms of harms and abuse. There also needs awareness and sensitization among other co-workers. Therefore, organizations need to focus on rights and well-being of the Hijra through inductions and ongoing awareness-raising sessions organized for the all level of workers of a company, of a CSO, of an establishment. Also, there needs awareness among the Hijra employees to know that, to know the organization's reporting system, like what to complain. And also they need to know how reports will be handled and who will be involved in processing or managing the complaints, how confidentiality will be ensured, so that they are rest assured that their complaints will be dealt with sincerely and responsibly. Also, we know that there are risks at the community level as well. So when the Hijra employees who are assigned for the community-based work, there needs to raise awareness for the community people. And those awareness raising sessions need to focus on the SCH risk for the Hijra population and the role of the community, how the community can play a role to address the risk for them. Finally, I would like to share that there also needs to change at the law and policy level. Like in Bangladesh, there is the policy recognition for the Hijra population, but there still needs legal recognition of the Hijra population and for other gender diverse population groups. There needs to reform penal laws and also other special laws who are to deal with the gender-based violence, so that the people with the Hijra identities, they can report and they can seek remedy for any offenses committed against them, including the offenses like gender-based violence, etc. So, and yeah, that's all from my side for now. I'll be happy to hear any comments, any questions to respond.
Thank you so much, Nazly, for this very interesting presentation and the tip sheet. Audience, we would like to know, what reflections do you have on this case study just presented by Nazly on the Hijra community in Bangladesh? If you have any reflections that you would like to share, please share them in the chat. And of course, a reminder, if you have a question for the panelists, including Nazly, please put them in the Q&A box. Be sure to mention the panelists that you're addressing your question to, so that they may answer in writing, even if we cannot respond to them directly verbally. Now let's look at the broader issues in inclusive safeguarding practices in other parts of the world. I'm sure that some of the important issues that Nazly discussed resonate for our other panelists, as they might resonate with you, audience. So let's turn to Nigeria and hear from Adetunde Adefemu from the Joint National Association of Persons with Disabilities. Adetunde, what is your reaction to Nazly's case, and what has your organization been doing to promote inclusive PSDH approaches?
Thank you very much, Fabienne, and nice to join everyone. It's been interesting listening to different perspectives, and of course it brings to bear the context of intersectional thinking. So by definition of JONAPWD, as a Joint National Association of Persons with Disabilities, so we are the federation of the Coalition of Persons with Disabilities in Nigeria. And by that context, we have the RSH team in country to think, for us to think beyond and above how these issues affect persons with disabilities. And of course, it resonates very perfectly what Nazly just mentioned, because for us as persons with disabilities, we consider age, we consider gender dimensions, impairment categories. And by that definition, we try to raise awareness since the research we've had in country with support from RSH Nigeria to think about how these things affect different categories of persons with disabilities in Nigeria. And of course, the kinds of systems and policies that must be responsive to how you prevent sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment broadly. So these are things that we're intentional about as a federation. And issues that has to do with cultural biases, religious biases, barriers that stems from some of these concerns, more or less. And we're very intentional about putting up issues, putting up context to address them broadly. So yes, for us, yes, we're very, very keen about that. So yes, thank you very much, Nazly, for bringing up this context. Thank you.
Thank you, Adetunde, for sharing your perspective. It sounds as if your organization has embedded some excellent practices also to promote more effective disability inclusion. Let's turn to Festus, who will offer some further thoughts on intersectionality. Festus, please could you share some of your thoughts on intersectionality risks and considerations when delivering programs?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will draw my lessons from the research that we conducted on refugees. Although part of it also, as much as it was tackling LGBTQ refugees, I feel like some of the lessons can be used for other LGBTQ persons who are in repressive or country that who live in criminalized countries. The first thing that we did was around understanding safeguarding issues was understanding the context, and the context for us was what's the legal environment in the countries that we work in that the LGBTQ people exist in. So we looked at laws, we looked at legal provisions, and we find that in many countries or in many parts of the world, the law is not homosexuality is criminalized. We also looked at social attitudes. We noticed that highly conservative countries have patriarchal and cis-heteronormative environments, which affects, which contributes to safeguarding risks. And we also looked at presence of LGBTQ plus organizations. So at national level, regional, and local, we noticed that when there's presence of national organizations, there's at least we know that there's efforts to fight for human rights, promote, and there's also, at least some sort of LGBT specific social services that are being offered. We also looked at risks that come out instead, like for example, discrimination and risk of outing by non-LGBTQ actors. We know that this is it's a very key thing. We looked at risks of risk in LGBTQ specific, including for example, for people who are in humanitarian settings, what are the risks that they face? And we looked at, for example, not many people in the community know about the status or the identities of the refugees, which is similar to people, to LGBTQ plus people who live in communities. Not many people know about our identities, which is a risk, which is a safeguarding risk, because it leads to threats of being outed, blackmail, and so on. And when you're trying to and not only is it in the refugee camps, but also in social settings. For example, if you look visibly queer, or if you're a man and you look effeminate, if you're openly trans, that there's risk of discrimination and violence in public. So these are some of the things you have to think about. How much knowledge people have about the existence of LGBTQ plus people. Are we aware of trans people? Because such knowledge, and we find that in urban settings, there's an assumption that most people know about this. So there's increased levels or there's targeted efforts towards safeguarding. But in rural areas, we find that this information is not available. Level of education also affects the kind of safeguarding measures that we can take as CSOs. We find that if the information that we have, is it available in local languages? For example, when you're talking about sexual orientation, gender identity, how inclusive are we in the, do we adapt that to local languages, or do we say that in English, therefore perpetuating the risk that this is a Western concept, when you look at geographic, I've already talked about geographical location, but also ethnicity, race, disability. There's an assumption that queer people cannot be, that you cannot have a disability and be queer. So how are we working towards that? Like, we need to, even when you're designing interventions, we need to be aware that LGBTQ plus people are everywhere. So you can't, even in the space that you're in as a civil society actor, you need to make those provisions. There's a lot of pressure that has been given to LGBTQ organizations to be responsible for their own safeguarding, because we assume that, since we are caring about people with disabilities, that LGBTQ people should find their own safeguarding measures, but it's not true. LGBTQ people exist everywhere, and we should be mindful of that. The other thing that came out of this work was the issues around addressing the risks, because people feel like SARE is different for LGBTQ plus people than the rest of the community. There's also and even in the LGBTQ communities themselves, there is also lack of understanding. People feel like it can't happen to me. When I'm looking at that from when we look at gay and bi men, we don't see SARE as a risk factor, yet we know that it does happen. So this affects reporting, and the silence. And the silence around these issues means that we are not able to adequately provide services. So I think we also need to look at this as we are addressing intersectionality. The other thing is also around reporting. I don't think we provide enough spaces for inclusive reporting, and this is what happens when you don't adopt an intersectional lens. So, for example, when we look at SARE only affecting young women and girls, we lock out queer women, we lock out trans women, and we lock out gay men. And this leads to inaction. And sometimes we're not guided into in terms of how we can report, which kind of information we should collect, what are the referral pathways that we can use, because we have not sensitized enough people around this. So, for example, I know in instances of sexual violence, there are times when someone can go to a police station and the police officer will ask, how can a man sexually violate another man? Or if it's in case of GBV, there's or intimate partner violence, someone will say, but you're two men, how do you allow another man to beat you? So this lack of inclusion, and so sometimes we're tempted to over collect information, so we end up taking information that is sensitive, that we don't know how to store it. So and I'll give an example of, for example, if we take very specific information, like we take personal details, we take information on location, but then we don't store the information correctly. Like if it means that anyone can walk into the office and have that information, or if it's in hard copy and our offices are not locked, or we don't have drawers that are locked, it means that during an office raid, or if this information is leaked, we are increasing the risk of safeguarding. So these are some of the things that have come up that I can think of right now, that when you're not adopting an inclusive approach, an intersectional approach, we lock out key people in our responses, and it also puts us at risk, because it means that we're not we are one-sided in safeguarding, and we know that as someone spoke earlier, safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. So we have to be very mindful of that. And I think from that, it would also be personally an approach that has helped me is just explore who are we not including in the conversation. When you look at women, and you look at men and all their diversity, when you're looking at refugees, are we just assuming one identity, that refugees are just one thing? What other intersecting identities or overlapping identities may they have that may expose them to SARE? and also just constantly working on our personal biases around these topics. That's all I can share for now. I'm open to questions, and I'll be looking at my question and answer section for any questions. Over to you, Fabienne.
Thank you so much, Festus. And in a bit, we will hear from Emily, but I just want to circle back really briefly to Adetunde, because now that we've heard from Festus about like LGBTIQ specific needs and considerations, we would love to hear just a little bit more from Adetunde about practical steps that can be taken for the disability community, and also how that reflects on intersectional approach. So Adetunde, would you share some practical examples from the work that you are doing?
Yes, thank you very much, Fabienne. With understanding that the more severe the disability, the greater the risk, that drives our approach in addressing the gaps that the research that we conducted with the RSH team in country brought to bear. And one thing that is a very severe gap that we say is the understanding within the community. The definition of safeguarding, the definition of the dynamics around and share is largely unknown. So it becomes very, very, very difficult for us to even capture. Also, that like Elena, I think Elena mentioned earlier, I've forgotten her name now, because very difficult for us to capture some of these safeguarding highlights or triggers across the community. And that's one thing we're trying to do, to increase awareness within the community, particularly as it intersects with different categories of persons with disabilities. It's one thing for you to be a person with disability. It's another thing to be someone with multiple disability. And of course, that rubs off regarding the kinds of approach that needs to be done. So amongst us as persons with disabilities, we upskill ourselves in terms of the awareness for us to know the dynamics around safeguarding. That's one. Number two is about the policies and programs. For instance, post-research, as the Federation, we had to improve our policy, safeguarding policy. And of course, with the support of the RSH team in country. And by the definition of our membership, that is scaling down to that approach for all the organizations of persons with disabilities to be aware that this is a concept that is emerging and the dynamics needs to be understood properly for you to capture it and respond to it. And one other thing we do as a federation is to be intentional about putting sessions around safeguarding into our mainstream programs, cross-cutting programs more or less. We see it as an opportunity. A lot has been said regarding funding constraints for us to actually amplify the definitions of safeguarding and how it intersects with persons with disabilities. Now we take on that opportunity to mainstream this, to upskill organizations of persons with disabilities, and of course, unpack the layers, the different layers of how it intersects with gender, particularly women with disabilities, young persons with disabilities, young girls with disabilities, children with disabilities, and for all these things to come together so that we have a very robust system that actually responds to, of course, protecting the rights of persons with disabilities more or less. One other thing we're currently doing that is mapping out referral services across the country. Nigeria is very large, and that's one thing that we're currently doing. So that irrespective of your location as persons with disabilities, it's a person with disability. It's important that as you understand the definition of safeguarding or definition of how different discriminatory approaches affect your livelihood, then you can easily report it, and of course that is addressed. Like said earlier during the first panel, if any victim or survivor of maybe sexual harassment or abuse is not assumed to get justice, then of course you begin to see that issues around reporting these issues, these safeguarding issues, will never come to bear. I will not have a justifiable system that captures and responds effectively to these dimensions. So for us as a federation, one is for us to mainstream safeguarding elements across the policies organization of persons with disabilities. Number two, what we're currently doing is to upskill we as persons with disabilities on the different definitions so that we know the dimensions. And number three is for us to capture all referral centers so that we can layer in on whatever it is that is being currently done. By definition of networks, we currently do not have networks that respond to share issues in country. But we have referral centers that respond to GBV issues, that's gender-based violence issues. Now, having to even engage with these centers for them to open up the scope of GBV, and of course, captures those little things that affect the lives of persons with disabilities and our rights. So these are things that we're currently doing, and they're important for us as the Federation. So we see this as a very good strategy as we move forward, more or less. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adetunde, for adding on to your earlier reflections on the case that was presented by Nazly. Now, when talking about intersectionality and inclusion, let's not underestimate the importance of language. We know that language inclusion is more than just translation and interpretation. I'm very curious to hear from Emily. Emily, could you share more about this? How does language maintain or reinforce inequalities or exclusion?
Firstly, thank you so much to the Resource and Support Hub for hosting this excellent conference today, to Fabienne for the excellent chairing, and to our team of interpreters who are helping make this conference accessible across some different languages today. And I'm really grateful to be able to join such an important discussion with the rest of the panelists this morning. So translation is, of course, one vital step towards making the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse more inclusive, more accessible, and available to more people. But a comprehensive approach needs to consider the role of language beyond translation and the role that language can play in all aspects of a program. So firstly, language can significantly compound vulnerability and exposure to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. But the humanitarian and development sector does not yet properly understand or measure how language intersects with some of the other factors of identity that we've already heard about today from the other speakers. We all know that groups who already experience some form of discrimination or exclusion or vulnerability generally in society face a higher risk of experiencing sexual exploitation, abuse, or harassment. This includes, of course, women and girls, but also boys, people with disabilities, as we've heard about, people from minority ethnic groups, refugees, we've also heard about this morning, people experiencing economic precarity, older adults, I could go on. But the key message that I'd like to share with you today is that all of these groups, because of the social, cultural, or economic exclusion that they are subjected to, are much less likely to have had the chance to go to school and to learn a national or dominant language, to be literate, to have access to communication tools, or access to information. And so what this means is that people who are already facing some level of exclusion or discrimination face a higher risk of experience of sexual violence and are less likely to be able to access the information and the services that they need, less likely to be able to report an experience of sexual violence or to ask for help. And so language really needs to be considered as a critical amplifier of risk when we think about safeguarding programming. So we have conducted several pieces of research in several humanitarian contexts about communicating about the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, about talking about gender and violence more generally. And we consistently find that information and communication about SEA is rarely aligned to the language and communication issues and challenges that communities themselves face. And this significantly reduces the reach and the effectiveness of that communication, and again reinforces the exclusion of already excluded groups. For example, we recently researched communication about gender-based violence with Oxfam and with some Ukrainian civil society organizations working within Ukraine. And it was interesting to hear Festus's remarks about the levels of exclusion faced by members of the LGBTQ+ community. In this piece of research in Ukraine, we also found this to be a risk factor. We found that communication that organizations created about sexual exploitation and abuse and gender-based violence almost exclusively targeted Ukrainian-speaking adult women in heterosexual relationships. So adult women who are experiencing violence by men who could fully understand Ukrainian. And this reinforced exclusion of other groups at risk of sexual violence, including adult men, members of the LGBTQ+ community, Roma community members who we also spoke to, who could not fully understand Ukrainian, or some of them could not understand Ukrainian at all, and children and young people. We also found in this research that fundamental terms and concepts used in English are not appropriate or understood in Ukrainian. And it was interesting as well to hear reflections on that from some of the other speakers about the kind of the Western concepts used to talk about sexual exploitation and abuse. This research found that the term gender does have a Ukrainian translation, but our research participants told us that they often associated this word with the LGBTQ+ community, and not with gendered social norms more generally. And there were two unintended consequences of this. Firstly, it reduced people's understanding of information about gender-based violence because they thought it was something about the LGBTQ+ community only. And secondly, it reinforced negative stereotypes and discriminatory attitudes against members of the LGBTQ+ community. A couple of years ago, we spoke to some local organizations and community members in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo about communication on SEA. And we found that most materials were in French, which was completely inaccessible to the majority of the population. Most reporting hotlines were only available in French or French and Congolese Swahili, neither of which were appropriate for most community members, especially women, and especially groups who were more at risk of exclusion and experiencing violence. Seeking help was largely unsafe. Women told us that they did not own their own phones to call services for support or, report something to a hotline, and suggestion boxes and complaint boxes were opened in public spaces, sometimes in front of the often male staff member who had perpetrated the abuse. So we can see that this was completely unacceptable. And so what I'd like to wrap up my discussion with is that we can see that language plays a really critical role in the power dynamics that can lead to instances of exploitation and abuse, and that leave survivors unable or unwilling or feeling unsafe to seek help. Understanding how language and power intersect can help organizations to mitigate some of the harmful power inequalities that lead to abusive environments. So women, adolescent girls, children of any gender are more exposed to sexual exploitation and abuse, and these groups are consistently more likely to experience a lack of linguistic power compared to men. Again, this is a more binary way of talking about gender than I would like, but for the sake of brevity of time, I'm afraid I have to do so. Gendered social norms also restrict access to information channels and ability to communicate with humanitarian organizations. Perpetrators of abuse often comfortably speak the working language of the organization and sometimes of the investigative authorities. And this gives them a lot more linguistic power during investigations in relation to the victim or survivor, who might need an interpreter, who might have no common language with the people conducting the investigation. Powerful actors also dominate the narrative about PSEA, including through developing principles and guidance in global and dominant languages, which are rolled out top-down to national and local contexts. This reinforces the prevalence of Western and Anglo-centric terms and concepts about gender, sex, and violence that often do not align with how people talk about or understand these topics in their own languages and cultural contexts. And the last point I'd like to make about power is that junior staff and volunteers are already in relatively less powerful positions and are more likely to be further disempowered by having difficulty understanding dominant and international languages. And this can make it much harder for them to speak up about their experiences or any behaviour that they witness. So what I'd like to end on is kind of leaving you with thinking about the fact that language is not just sort of a technical aspect or something that can be solved through translation. It's a deeply personal and a deeply emotional aspect of each one of our identities and the ways in which each one of us moves through the world and interacts with other people. And yeah, I'm looking forward to how the rest of the conversation develops over today and tomorrow. Okay, thank you. Back to you, Fabienne.
Thank you so much, Emily. This is such a key element to consider when we're looking at inclusion and overlapping forms of inequality. I see there's some interesting questions coming into the Q&A. Please, audience, keep asking those questions to our speakers. They will be able to respond to them in writing in the Q&A box. We're now going to move towards collaborative solutions and future actions. Now, panelists, let's talk about solutions and approaches from each of your perspectives. Adetunde, from your organization's experience, what should be the first steps taken when designing PSCH initiatives to meet the needs of marginalized people?
Thank you, Fabienne. I think broadly speaking, it's very important to conduct a safeguarding readiness assessment. Like said and reemphasized, it's not very healthy to take on a one-size-fits-all approach. And from the disability perspective, we know this now. And one of the things that we carry forward in terms of awareness creation is that everyone, irrespective of the context where you enable human rights, must understand that persons with disabilities, we are not an homogeneous group. And when this intersects with gender issues, age issues, literacy issues, and these things are things that brings in different dimension into how you can address share issues in countries. So the first steps for you as an organization to conduct safeguarding readiness assessment so that you can determine how your organization is well prepared to keep people from harm and any form of abuse. Number two, you have to be ready to, of course, develop the appropriate policies within your organization and how it reflects which organization's mandate and the scope of your organization. That's also very important, so that in itself determines how your organization is well prepared to respond to share issues broadly. Number three is knowing how to address the knowledge gap. Like said and reemphasized, you can't address what you don't understand. So as an organization or as a people, or us as persons with disabilities, we must understand it. And for us to have an holistic approach to this, we must know how well someone in the village, in the ruralness of Nigeria, understand share issues and is able to report share issues with all confidence that this, of course, he or she will get justice to this report and not being blacklisted in any kind of systemic biases or stigma. That's very important to us. So training and retraining people, organizations broadly, it's one very key step after you developing policies and programs. Number four is for you to have, as an organization, you need to have a focal person in charge of share issues. And for us, post the RSA research in Nigeria, one thing we did immediately was for us to institute a focal person for safeguarding issues that addresses these responses. And of course, bring on board trainings and retrainings for the staff of the community, for the community as it were, more or less. And that's one thing in terms of steps taken for everyone to understand more or less. And the fifth thing for us is having a robust system that captures how your programs, your policies, how effective they are in terms of how they are able to respond to these needs, more or less broadly. And one thing I want to talk about generally, and I'll use the lens of disability inclusion. Issues around, we have the 4A and Q, and one of the A speaks to accessibility. So when you design these policies and these programs, And when you design them for them to respond to everybody, intersecting with persons with disabilities, it must be accessible. Like the earlier speaker said about persons with hearing impairment, we also have those with visual impairment. We have those who are wheelchair users. And these are things that you must consider broadly. Number two is how available these your programs are for persons with disabilities, because if you institute programs, of course, that are cost intensive, then persons with disabilities will be able to access it because they are in itself, they are not available, they are not affordable. And of course, these things must be co-designed by persons with disabilities for us to accept them more or less. Then, of course, ensuring that it is of high quality for us to enjoy these rights and make sure that we are protected, what kind of context that we find ourselves, irrespective of the layers of intervention. Thank you very much, Fabienne.
Thanks, Adetunde. Those are extremely insightful suggestions and considerations. Emily, what practical measures should organizations use to promote language inclusion in safeguarding?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm actually going to borrow a phrase that Adetunde just said, which is you cannot address what you don't understand. And I think that's absolutely critical when we think about bringing a language inclusion lens to preventing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So firstly, organizations need to understand and be aware of the role of language in the communities that they work in and in the effectiveness of their programs. This starts with looking at data about the languages that people are using, their communication preferences, researching language and communication barriers, including language in vulnerability assessments, and also internally within the organization, interrogating the assumptions that you're making about language. Often I hear when I speak to organizations that they tell me, oh yes, but this area, we know that everyone speaks Swahili in this area. And I think that's a really interesting claim to make when language by its very nature, if you do not speak the language, then you cannot be heard. So I think even internally asking, you know, where are we getting the information about how people want to speak with us and want us to speak with them or communicate with them. Secondly, is about sort of practically acting on language exclusion. And this is what most people tend to think of when they think about acting on language. This is steps like translating material into the languages that you have identified as most relevant for your community members. Organizations can also, if they don't have a translation budget, something that is really effective in terms of expanding communication is writing the information in plain language. And plain language is a style of communicating that focuses on using simple terminology, structuring information as clearly as possible, putting the most important information first, and being kind of as plain and as clear as possible. And what this does is, in contexts where people might have the ability to communicate in a second language to some degree, it makes that information as clear as possible for them. So perhaps they're not able to speak that language fluently, they would prefer to be able to communicate in their first language, but they can still access some of the information they need because it's in plain language in a second language. So that's something to keep in mind if you're worried about translation budgets. Of course, first languages should be the goal. What's also a good practical step is pilot testing all of your communication material. So this is something, again, we hear from organizations, from our research, sorry, not organizations, from community members, is that they have access to material and it might be even in their first language, but they still don't understand it. And it's because that material uses incorrect terminology or terminology that is not appropriate for that community or that particular group or age, or even visual communication might use visuals that are confusing or misleading. And so pilot testing absolutely any material you plan to use can really help you identify communication risks. And lastly, in terms of understanding language, organizations should assess the impact of language inclusion on improving their programming. So what they can do is disaggregate data on language use against other factors. So for example, disaggregating data on language use against gender of service users or something like that, or the age of service users, to identify where language is compounding other known factors of vulnerability or exclusion. Organizations in a position to channel financial resources can ask their funding applicants to explain in funding proposals how they plan to address language or what they already know about the language needs of their community. And in evaluations, they can make explicit how well the services and information reached and were used by different language communities. As a final point, I would like to emphasize that these measures do not have to be costly or time-consuming or require specialist knowledge. Something like having a conversation with your team about language barriers that you experience or that your community could face is free, but it can go a really long way in helping people think more actively about language barriers that are present, including one question in an assessment. So for example, what is the main language you use? Or what is your preferred language for spoken communication or written communication or signed communication? Including one question in assessments is a really low cost effort that can get you really, really helpful data to act on and measure where language exclusion is happening. Of course, higher investment things would be like running focus groups with different language communities based on the materials that you'd like to develop, co-developing material with different language communities, that sort of thing. But I recognize that organizations have different resources available. And in the goodie bag that will be sent out, there's lots of free tools and guides for you to start using as well. All right, thank you so much. Back to you, Fabienne.
Thank you so much, Emily, for those practical suggestions. And that really nice ties in nicely to the last question that I have for Nazly and Festus, which is, what would you say to those who may feel that intersectionality is just too hard to integrate into your program or your services? We would love to hear from you what you have learned about how to integrate intersectionality into your work, even when there is limited time and even when you have budget constraints. I would love to hear first from you, Festus. What would you say to those people?
Thank you for the question. I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that it has to start from the individual. So, and understanding that you have a role to play. Sometimes as employees in the civil society or in an organization, we tend to think that this is a responsibility of top management. But I would like to remind all of us that it has to start with us. So understanding, bringing an intersectional approach to the work that we do, and to the cases that we handle. And I'm just going to add, for example, in governance, if the challenge is in governance, for example, we can have a more diverse people in our board so that we make sure that everyone is represented. So for example, so really focusing on diversity and inclusion in the governing bodies. And also, and not just having that, but also reinforcing accountability and making steps towards and making sure that the people are accountable to the organization. The other thing that we can do is in culture and leadership, we can ensure that we have leaders and colleagues who recognize and encourage diversity, and not only that, but acknowledge power and privilege and potential bias, which might affect our approach towards, intersectionality and inclusion. Creating safe spaces for us to have these conversations around SARE, because I know most of the times we usually look at it from an external perspective. We look at it as, we are only focusing on the service users or people who come to us for services, but acknowledging it within the organization is very important. And you can also assess the attitudes of staff, assessing the intersectional analysis, like are we aware, or is this a buzzword that you're using, but as an employee or as a staff member, do I know about these things that we're talking about? In our program cycle, we should conduct safeguarding risk assessment and reporting mechanisms. And as the previous speaker spoke, this is as simple as, just asking ourselves, what do we understand in simple language and how do you communicate that? Sometimes we tend to complicate things, like, oh, this should be a workshop, this should be, a 1-day training or a 2-day training, but this is something we can do day to day in the office around that. And reach out to other organizations that have done this work before. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to we can reach out, find out who has done it before, what are the resources available, how do you adapt it to our context. It's very important to also, while we may have reporting mechanisms for other things like whistleblowing on anti-corruption or fraud and such, do we have such mechanisms for SARE? I think it's very important for us to have, and also communicate it. And I came across something, a line this morning, that we should have transparent, specific, and frequent communication on SARE. So in every place we go, so we talk about it, to the service users that we have, to staff members, to either at governance levels, are we having these conversations? Do you have provision for anonymous and safe reporting? So those are the simple things that we can do, because we already we have the structure. So also assessing ourselves internally is very important, and then just know how we can add on to that. So that is what I would say. Those are the simple things. It's really possible. We just have to commit ourselves. And lastly, because I know there's a conversation about funding. So how do we include that? And how we can do that. We can adopt an intersectional approach, especially when you're explaining our context and risk analysis section. So we should include SARE as part of our risk analysis in our proposals, and invite funders to further conversation on that, especially if they're not aware, and see if it's an area that they're willing to support. So like they say, you never really know until you ask. So maybe there is provision for that. So how do we include that and show the risk between programming and helping us achieve organizational goals and safeguarding SARE? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Festus. Finally, I would love to hear from Nazly. Nazly, what would be your response to those saying that intersectionality is just too hard or too expensive to integrate into programs or services?
Thank you, Fabienne. Yes, this is very common question we come across, like the intersectionality, it requires money, it requires time, but this is not necessarily the case. As we also heard from Festus, like from the previous speaker, I would echo the same, same reflection. Like the commitment of the leadership is important, and the understanding on the importance of using the intersectionality lens. Like if as a leader, as a top leadership of an organization, if I am committed that I will make my organization safe and secure for every individual, irrespective of the different identity groups. And if I understand that people with different identities, they experience SEH differently, and like the SEH risks are higher for some groups than the other groups. Like for the Hijra community, during the consultations, they shared that like people considered that anybody can touch a body of a Hijra, like physical contact. It is taken for granted. It doesn't need consent. That sort of attitude are there, even within the co-workers level. So what is needed? It is needed that when we have a policy on safeguarding or PSH policy, if the policy explicitly mentions that they are committed to ensure a safe work environment for all, irrespective of the identity groups. And equally, this is important, also linked with the language. like explicit language, mention that they are committed to ensure the rights of the persons with disabilities and also the Hijra people, for example. Then it gives a message how the organization thinks about the safety and well-being of those groups. And then comes with the code of conduct. If the code of conduct explicitly mention how the SCH issues towards the Hijra population or the persons with disability will be addressed, will be considered, that gives a message. And also, like, when the organization does the risk assessment, which is important, then in that risk assessment exercise, to learn from those people from different identity groups, how they experience. This is important. And if it is noted down, if it is reflected in the policies and response measures, then it doesn't require, additional money, additional resources. And also, like, when you organize awareness raising sessions or the induction at the when staff joins your organization, when you include the issue of intersectionality, how you treat that, how the organization treat the issue of SEH towards different groups of people, then it, that's the way how to make the people aware of the intersectionality issue and also to ensure safeguarding for all groups of people with different gender identities. And that does not necessarily require additional time, I would say also additional resources. So the commitment and understanding is important. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nazly.
That's all from myself.
Thank you. That was really amazing. Thank you, Nazly, and thank you all speakers of this interesting panel on intersectionality and safeguarding. We've learned so much, and not just by the speakers, but also there's been some really interesting contributions in the chat on contextual experiences in embedding intersectionality in programs. Even some tools have been shared, some publications, so do take a look. During this session, we've learned about so many helpful action points. Among others, we've covered that our approach must be intentional. We've covered that we should work with communities to explain and reframe intersectionality, taking a strengths-based approach. We've learned that we should mainstream inclusion and PSCH across all activities within the organization. We've learned that we should not work in silos, and that inclusion should be embedded into the culture of an organization. We know that there's a continuous need to upskill people on PSCH and disability risk. We've learned that consultation with program participants and marginalized groups cannot be underestimated. We've learned about adapted referral pathways and support mapping and how essential they are. And finally, we've learned about the power of language inclusion. For language inclusion, we also have a useful resource called the Clear Global Guidance. This resource, along with all other resources, presentations, and tools that we've discussed today, they will be made available to you after the conference via email, so do keep an eye on your inbox. We have now come to the end of day 1 of the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub Conference. What's next for safeguarding against SCH? The importance of CSO engagement in shaping sustainable solutions. Today we focused on PSCH in challenging contexts, and we focused on intersectionality and safeguarding. Audience, we would like to thank you for your active participation by sharing your contributions and your reflections in the chat, and also for your great questions to our speakers. They've been working really hard to answer all of them. I think they've all been answered in writing. And in that, I would extend an extra thank you to all the speakers of today for your valuable contributions.